Well, ladies and gentlemen, Your Eminence, Dale Cardinal, of course, our distinguished guest, Archbishop J. Michael Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. You know, this evening's presentation is really more than just an academic presentation. It's really a homecoming for someone who has meant so much to us here at St. Thomas, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. Thank you so much again for joining us. This past year, we have seen the passing of two individuals who have been very important to the Center for Thomistic Studies. Of course, first is our founder, Father Victor Brezek, who had the vision, the courage, and the fundraising ability to put in place the only Center for Thomistic Studies in the United States. And the other was Alexander Giampietro, the father of Reverend Anthony Giampietro, who again has been, especially in recent years, such an important part of our institute. So what I ask you to do just for a moment, please, is to bow our heads and ask for the good Lord to bless them and say, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. May their souls and the souls of all the faithfully departed rest in peace. Amen. Thank you so much. You know, we are blessed here at St. Thomas with a real constellation of outstanding centers. You know, centers really have two purposes. One, of course, is to educate the undergraduate or graduate students within the university. But the second is to be a wonderful channel of education to the community around us. I saw Dr. Laurie Gallagher here earlier, Center for Thomistic Studies, the Irish Studies. I see Father Nesty here somewhere also for the Center for Faith and Culture, Center for International Studies. We are so blessed to have these outreaches in the community so that the goodness which we have internally shines forth. And of course, our oldest and most revered part of the constellation of centers is the one that Father Brezek himself started, and that is the Center for Thomistic Studies. We are so very fortunate to have had since 2002 Dr. Mary Catherine Summers to lead that organization, and I know that she has taken she has embraced the mission and the concept of a center. Well, we're so very fortunate to have a visionary like her leading the center, and we look forward to many years under her leadership. So please welcome Dr. Mary Catherine Summers.
To mark its 25th year, the Center for Thomistic Studies initiated the Order of St. Thomas to be awarded to persons who have testified to the incomparable value of the philosophy of St. Thomas in their writings, teaching, philanthropy, or way of life. Each recipient is presented with a medal bearing an image of Thomas Aquinas, and the motto of the order, Quantum Potes Tantum Aude, dare to do all that you can. Past recipients include the late Avery Cardinal Dulles, Mr. George Strake, Jr., the Scanlon Foundation, the founders of the Center for Thomistic Studies, Father Brezek and Mr. Hugh Roy Marshall, and Father Leo Elders, an early friend of the center. This year we have the privilege of honoring someone who is both an old friend and one who has worked with admirable effectiveness to ensure that every Catholic university as Catholic has the essential characteristics enumerated in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, that the university community as such, not only individuals within it, should have a Christian inspiration, that its research should be a continuing reflection in the light of the Catholic faith on the growing treasury of human knowledge, that it should be faithful to the Christian message as transmitted by the Church, and that it should serve the people of God and the human family on its pilgrimage to the transcendent goal of human life. We are grateful, too, that Archbishop Miller has found the Center for Thomistic Studies to be a fitting instrument for securing these characteristics within the University of St. Thomas. At a particular troubled time in our history, then President Miller extended his personal support and the resources of his office to the renewal of the center. For his superb contributions towards realizing the vision of Ex Corde Ecclesiae in Catholic universities all over the world, and his firm friendship for the Center for Thomistic Studies, we present the Order of St. Thomas to Archbishop J. Michael Miller.
Thanks, Lynn. Can I put it on?
You could.
I will.
You could. Born in Ottawa, Canada in 1946, J. Michael Miller made his final profession with the Congregation of St. Basil in 1973 and was ordained a priest in 1975. He was ordained to the episcopate in January of 2004, an event Houstonians will not soon forget, and became the ordinary of the Archdiocese of Vancouver, BC in January 2009. He took his BA in 1969 from the University of Toronto and his MA in 1970 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, both in Latin American studies. After priestly ordination, he studied in Rome at the Pontifical Gregorian University, receiving his licentiate in sacred theology in 1976 and his doctorate in 1979. This transcript, academic and ecclesial, is unambiguous. Archbishop Miller has always been the valedictorian, the 4.0, the summa cum laude. No one who worked with then Father Miller at UST could fail to understand why he always excelled. Tireless in the pursuit of the perfect, he also possesses a jeweler's eye for the chip, the flaw, and the fake. He did his apprenticeship here at UST, starting as assistant professor in the theology department in 1979, and serving as dean of the School of Theology, chair of the theology department, and vice president for academic affairs, before becoming president in 1997. When he left UST in 2004 to become secretary of the Congregation for Catholic Education, he took with him experience of every facet of university life and a profound knowledge of American Catholic universities, 220 institutions which are indeed one of the modern wonders of the worldwide church. In his work for the congregation, he traveled widely, giving instruction and support to Catholic seminaries and universities all over the world, bringing the concerns of the Holy See before their faculty and administrators. Among these, as he said at Australian Catholic University in 2007, are the place of the Church's social doctrine in the university's teaching, research, and life, the role of pastoral ministry, and the importance of fostering international ecclesial solidarity among Catholic centers of higher learning. The university, both in concept and in its basic structures, was a gift to humanity from medieval Christian Europe. From Gregory IX in 1231, who called the University of Paris the parent of sciences, to John Paul II, who recognized the Catholic universities as born from the heart of the Church, popes have nurtured and admonished them. Since Leo XIII in 1879, popes have recommended and enjoined the study of Thomas Aquinas to Catholic universities. For reason, born on the wings of Thomas to its human height, can scarcely rise higher, while faith could hardly expect more or stronger aids from reason than those which she has already obtained through Thomas. Tonight we have the pleasure of hearing about the popes, the universities, and Thomas Aquinas from someone who is particularly fitted to speak on these topics. He is the editor of the encyclicals of John Paul II and the post-synodal apostolic exhortations of John Paul II, and the author of 2 books on the papacy. And he will speak to us on the Church's common doctor, Thomas Aquinas, and the contemporary Catholic University. Please join me in welcoming the 2010 Aquinas Lecture, Archbishop J. Michael Miller.
Thank you, of course, Dr. Summers, for your very gracious and kind introduction, and especially the honor of giving me the Order of St. Thomas. I'm extraordinarily grateful for that. I accepted giving this evening's lecture with a certain amount of trepidation. For over the years, of course, I've been present at many of these lectures, and I must say they were wonderful lectures and happy years. But what I have to say tonight is really not of the same high caliber of Thomistic scholarship that has marked this series until now. Because I do not, and I cannot address you as an expert on St. Thomas and his thought. There are many in this assembly this evening who are truly far better equipped to carry out that task, and thanks be to God, actually do it on the university campus on a daily basis. But I will talk about St. Thomas. I'm a product, as each of us is, I'm a product of my times. And I came to know, even if indirectly, the clarity, the comprehensiveness, and the unified intellectual vision of St. Thomas through 8 years of studying the Baltimore Catechism, 4 years of being a student of a series of texts, which I think were called Our Goal and Our Guides, which introduced ninth graders to St. Thomas's treatise on the angels. Through these and similar texts, indeed several generations of Catholics in North America received a truly coherent message about the Catholic faith, which, albeit not in perfect form, is nonetheless greatly indebted to the revival of Thomism, which was launched in the beginning of in the middle of the 19th century. And for us, the 1950s, being Catholic and engaging in serious scientific and philosophical pursuits posed no problem for the boys and girls in Catholic schools. We were well armed for battle, and we knew it. Later, of course, Aquinas played a more direct role in my studies in philosophy and theology. But already in the early post-conciliar years, he no longer guided learning as he had for my confreres even a decade earlier. So I'm with you this evening, as an admirer of St. Thomas, as a former member of this community, and as a bishop with a certain knowledge and experience of higher education in the life of the Universal Church. It was really here at UST, and later working at the Vatican, that led me through the years to an ever greater conviction that the teaching and method of St. Thomas can, and indeed must, make a contribution, an irreplaceable contribution to the intellectual life of the academy, of higher education, and of the church. Moreover, of the academy in the church. I can't but express my admiration for the role that UST has given and continues to give to Aquinas through its undergraduate curriculum, and especially through its now world-renowned Center for Thomistic Studies. Indeed, I remember well, and I know there are others in this room who were present, the kind of formal and festive launching of the center, which took place here, and it was in Houston in the fall of 1979, was my first semester as an assistant professor of theology. And at that time, Father Brezek had already set very high standards for everything associated with the vision that he relentlessly and patiently put into place. So it's wonderful that we prayed for him, and it's not, I think, out of place even to invoke his blessing upon us today. This is the first St. Thomas Day at UST, without Father Brezek in more than 55 years, a man who gave himself, truly wonderfully to an incredible enterprise. It's for me an honor to be back here on campus, have this opportunity to say a few words about the patron of our university. This university, born from the heart of the church, and so integrally tied to the church's mission of proclaiming the gospel. UST has publicly accepted this vocation and this responsibility. And because of this, it can escape a rather late medieval judgment on universities that I'd like to share with you. But think Regensburg, this is not what I intend to say, it's what others have said. Universities, with their programs of study, their colleges, their degrees, and their professorships, are products of vain heathenism. They are as much good to the church as the devil is. Fortunately, in 1415, the Council of Constance condemned this proposition of John Wycliffe, even if some today, and some bishops perhaps, are sometimes tempted to side with the Council Fathers. In all I have to say this evening about the contemporary Catholic university, I'll be referring mostly to institutions here in the United States, perhaps in an accommodated way to Canada, but the situation is different. To these institutions which, in varying degrees, are seeking to implement Pope John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, as well as the norms of application of the American bishops. As for St. Thomas himself, I think we have to honestly admit that he never put his mind to worrying about how to think about a Catholic university, either at his time or any other. His writings never touch upon matters of faculty, of students, or curriculum in the way that they concern us today. But he was concerned and did show and did propose specific views about how knowledge is acquired, views about truth and the relationship of faith and reason, which are, I believe, of permanent value to understanding how the contemporary Catholic university should carry out its research and its teaching. What I propose to do then is to look briefly at the study of Thomism in centers of higher education, universities and seminaries, following the revival initiated by Pope Leo XIII, and then suggest a couple of reasons why St. Thomas has been called a light for the church and the whole world. Above all, of course, the world of the Catholic Academy. I rely, of course, on Thomas himself, but also to see Thomas through the eyes and the teaching of three popes. I rely upon Paul VI, who was Pope during the the seventh centenary in 1974, which occasioned many talks of his on Thomas, as well as a very important letter, Lumen Ecclesiae, the encyclical Fides et Ratio of John Paul II, as well as several talks that he routinely gave to the International Congress on Thomistic Studies, and also on Pope Benedict, who, as I'll show, relies, despite his Augustinian background, still relies heavily on Thomas and cites Thomas with a great deal of, how would I say, unexpected praise. Certainly he doesn't quite get the attention that Augustine does, but St. Thomas is in Benedict's thought. And I suspect that within the next 6 or 8 weeks that we will have a long, serious Wednesday address on St. Thomas The Holy Father's reached up, I think, to St. Francis, and so he's just getting into the medieval period, and I'm sure there will be a sustained laudatio of Thomas. First, then, let's just take a brief look at Leo XIII, his encyclical Aeterni Patris, and the great revival of Thomistic thought, which pushed the church at the end of the 19th century right up through the mid-20th century in a very specific direction, which is, in fact, at the foundation of the University of St. Thomas. There is a direct line that goes from Leo XIII to Father Brisic and to the founding of the center. Thomas is here, of course, venerated, not only as the one who's been called a supreme genius and teacher of the past, but also for his continuing relevance, the relevance of his principles, his teaching, and his method. Paul VI affirmed in 1974, "There can be no doubt that in God's providential plan, St. Thomas represents the high point of all scholastic theology and philosophy, and that his works are the main foundation on which all Christian teaching in the Church, then and now, can firmly rest and safely grow." Already in 1870, 80 years before, or 100 years before, Leo XIII had laid out the reasons for the stream of adulation that in the last century sort of has accompanied public statements about St. Thomas. Here's a sample from Leo. It's quite wonderful. Among the scholastic doctors towers Thomas Aquinas, the chief and master of all, who is rightly and deservedly esteemed as the special bulwark and glory of the Catholic faith. Then Leo added, with his spirit at once humble and swift, his memory ready and tenacious, his life spotless throughout, a lover of truth for its own sake, richly endowed with human and divine science, like the sun, he heated the world with the warmth of his virtues and filled it with the splendor of his teaching. After this, of course, Leo, sort of his intervention, galvanized the renewal in philosophical and theological studies in light of St. Thomas, which had already begun in the generation preceding the publication of the encyclical in 1879. And the Pope built on a fundamental principle which lent his encyclical its unity. And we'll return to this. The harmony between the truths of faith and those of reason. This is what was uppermost in his mind, trying to take on what had emerged in the 19th century as sort of two extremes battling each other. On the one hand was a rationalism, the use of reason, chucking faith without faith, or simply sort of blind faith, a kind of fideism, which mocked or scorned or made little use of reason. Leo wrote sort of against these ideas. He said, clearly distinguishing, as is fitting, reason from faith, while happily associating the one with the other, Thomas both preserved the rights and had regard for the dignity of each. So much so, and this Dr. Summers quoted, indeed, that reason born in the wings of Thomas to its human height can scarcely rise higher. After 1879, the papacy was at the forefront of a great resurgence in the study of St. Thomas, what was called the golden wisdom of St. Thomas. This revival, of course, is what influenced UST and its founders. Pius X, for example, in the early 20th century, mandated that in pontifical institutions, the Summa Theologiae should be the basic textbook. He also had drawn up, and this is certainly more debatable, in the aftermath of modernism, a decree on, there were 34 Thomistic theses, mostly philosophical theses, concerned with Thomistic realism that were to be enforced. Later on, under Pius XI, in the 1920s, he had a famous statement that encapsulates, I think, the real beginnings of Neo-Thomism that links UST to this movement. He said, go to Thomas. Read Thomas and read the texts. Don't just read the manuals or the summaries. You know, he wanted to get back to the genius of the original. This reading of Thomas in the 1920s and 30s, especially in France, was accompanied by a more deliberate taking into account not just what Thomas wrote, but the whole historical and the intellectual and the spiritual context in which he lived and worked. A kind of a Thomism, to be able to see it in situ. This assumption, Thomas sort of in his environment, this was the assumption that lay at the foundation of the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies, founded by the Basilians in 1929, and then later given such distinction by Jacques Maritain and Étienne Gilson. Following Gilson's retirement in 1968 from the Institute, we see kind of coming into place that the center of gravity of the Institute, and this is typical of many others, shifted away from direct reading of St. Thomas into areas of associated medieval interest. This mirrored a kind of diminished interest in philosophical and theological circles in St. Thomas himself. Throughout this period, St. Thomas, his method and his teaching showed themselves to be remarkably subtle and able to be at the basis of the foundation of the articulation of the Church's social teaching, which also sort of dates from Leo XIII. If we look now at the period around the Second Vatican Council, it's clear that at the time of the council and going up to the council, that the teaching of St. Thomas sort of formed the minds of the fathers or of the curia officials who were preparing the documents for the council. When it came to the council itself, however, there was, in the manner of articulation, of writing the documents, a desire to use a language which departed from the scholastic language of St. Thomas. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. There are, however, two places at the council where the teaching of St. Thomas is specifically recommended. This is the first time a council of the church had ever recommended that a particular theologian deserved this kind of attention. It was done in the decree for priestly formation, that the philosophy presented to seminarians should, as it says, they should learn to penetrate in their theology and philosophy the mysteries of salvation more deeply with the help of speculation under the guidance of St. Thomas. And later in its decree on education, which dealt with schools and colleges and universities, they commended St. Thomas for study because of the remarkable use he had made of the harmony between faith and reason. What's ironical, of course, in all of this is that just at the time Thomas is being given his highest sort of official praise in the church at an ecumenical council, what happens in the trenches is a kind of practical collapse of the teaching of St. Thomas in Catholic colleges, universities, and seminaries. Think here, however, where we do have a kind of alternate history to that. UST in this regard is not typical, but in general, there was a very serious decline in the study of Thomas, particularly in philosophy and theology. Some reasons can be suggested. One was, and they're good reasons, was the renewal of biblical scholarship prompted in the church by Pius XII, which put theology in a far more biblical and scriptural context. Therefore, sort of the looking at the articles of the Summa was not the normal way. You had to integrate scripture into your study. The other was, at the same time, theologians were going back to study the fathers of the church. 500 years, 600 years, 700 years, a century before Thomas. There was a great renewal of patristic thought, a little bit perhaps under the notion that this had been the golden age, sort of the closer to the time of the Lord, and therefore the medieval period was bypassed. Another, of course, and this is something that Aidan Nichols points out, he says there was a great desire, particularly in seminaries, which had been in some ways the shock troops of Thomism, to bring it into the public square. In theology, there was a great movement to teach theology in such a way that it could be immediately preachable. So that it could be, that the hard work of translation of theology into practical life, that it was taught in such a way that you didn't expect that kind of integration from the individual. It was done for you. Whatever, all of these, one can sort of judge these things, in different ways. What is true is that Pius XI's go to Thomas fell upon very hard times. This, despite a 1972 indication from the Holy See, from the Congregation of Catholic Education, that Thomas was to be an irreplaceable guide in philosophy, and so on. What happened next, or sort of at the same time, it's a wonderful way to read ecclesial documents. 1974 comes along, and Paul VI, despite what is happening around him, in this great document written to mark the 700th anniversary of the death of Thomas, he says this. He talked about the extraordinary, even if unforeseen, return of St. Thomas, which has confirmed the wisdom of the Supreme Magisterium in declaring him to be the authoritative, irreplaceable guide in philosophy and theology. In point of fact, in 1974, this was not the case. This was an extraordinarily optimistic reading. It is something that perhaps could be said 30 or 35 years later. And either Paul VI was looking through a longer glass and thinking in terms of a longer time frame. I leave that to you. John Paul II, trained at the Angelicum in Thomistic philosophy, but with his own particular take on things, as was sort of to be expected of a man of his stature, his interest in phenomenology and so on. He nonetheless went out of his way to call upon Thomas as a model for the philosopher. But he walked very tenderly on ground which would suggest that the teaching of Thomas was in itself to be normative, particularly teaching philosophy in seminaries, which are much more under the direct and immediate control of the Holy See than universities. This is very typical of a statement of his, the one in Fides and Ratio. He will praise what has been said about Thomas and kind of endorse it by indirection. He says, "The magisterium has repeatedly acclaimed the merits of St. Thomas's thought and made him the guide and model for theological studies." But it's more a statement of fact than a ringing personal endorsement. It's also curious that in his major document on formation in the seminaries, Pastores Dabo Vobis, St. Thomas is cited, but he is not particularly recommended as the guide for either philosophy or theology. For that to happen, and I think this is where maybe Paul VI, his insight is bearing fruit, it comes to bear really in the American Bishop's 5th edition of the Program of Priestly Formation, published in 2006, when they are very explicit, more explicit than ever, about the role of Thomas's teaching in seminarians for their philosophical and theological studies. I think this is what Paul VI thought he saw around him, and I think is now, in fact, sort of realized, and it's in this country. Let me read you what they wrote. "The philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas should be given the recognition that the Church accords it. Especially in the courses on the history of philosophy, there should be a significant treatment of St. Thomas's thought, along with its ancient sources and its later development. The fruitful relationship between philosophy and theology in the Christian tradition should be explored through studies into mystic thought, as well as that of other great Christian theologians." And for the study of theology, they say, "Although various theological schools exist within the Catholic tradition in accord with church teaching, the significance of St. Thomas Aquinas as the model and guide for study and research in theology should be recognized." Seminaries in the future, and I think to a lesser extent perhaps, Catholic colleges will be looking for people who are prepared to teach in light of and knowing St. Thomas, whether it be in philosophy or in theology. Now I would like to turn to a couple reasons why St. Thomas is that towering figure for the contemporary Catholic university. Why Catholic universities simply need to take Thomas into account. And I'll talk about Thomas using sort of two Latin titles. The first one is to refer to him as the Doctor Veritatis. He is the teacher of truth. And the second one is Doctor Concordiae. He is the doctor or the teacher of the harmony between faith and reason. And to show how these two key insights are absolutely indispensable to the very well-being, the very essay of a Catholic university, and to do this by citing a little bit from the three popes, from Paul VI, John Paul, and Benedict XVI. Much can be said, I think, about the intellectual malaise of our current age, what John Paul called the weak thought of our contemporaries. But there's no single cause, that would satisfy everyone to how is this to be understood. Nonetheless, Benedict XVI is pointed out as one of the major challenges to the church of our century, one which he says, and I cite, one which presents a particularly insidious obstacle in the task of educating. What is this challenge? The massive presence of relativism in society and in the halls of the academy. So that the central problem of our system of higher education is not its failure to provide strong intellectual and marketable skills, which it can do well enough, but its premise that reality does not exist independently of the human mind and cannot be known with any certainty. So we saw just briefly that according to Benedict XVI, without being able to provide all the reasons for what's happening in contemporary thought, that he has identified relativism and its massive presence in society and in the academy as something that hinders the task of education. Therefore, relativism should be of concern to colleges and universities. And his reason, and he says this, is because relativism stifles the student's natural desire to know and to know the truth. That it's almost initially frustrating to put students into an environment where their natural desire to know what is true cannot be realized because the presuppositions of the academy are such that it's impossible. And another consequence of this relativistic assumption, and perhaps an even more serious one, is that even if a person does practice his or her faith, the assumption in the academy is that such faith has nothing to do with truth. Therefore, it has nothing to do with the core interest of a university, which is teaching and research. Faith only has to do with the private or the devotional life of the individual. In situations where what makes a university Catholic is not the content of what is taught, in other words, the curriculum, but only the laudable concern for the whole student, then its intellectual foundation has been weakened, perhaps beyond repair. Important as student life is to expressing or helping people express their faith, it can never replace the curriculum as the principal locus of genuine Catholicity in the world of higher education. It's the curriculum, it's what we do that counts. All too often, relativism and privatized faith are not only the academic's creed, but also that of the person in the street. And the great fear that we hear and the cry that goes up that it's authoritarian to speak about truth, that it's unacceptable in a truly pluralist society, it is claimed, to talk about truth. This is what Benedict XVI referred to in that now famous phrase of his in his homily preached as the cardinals were entering the conclave before his election, when he talked about that we live in a dictatorship of relativism. In fact, in many universities, seeking truth is considered hopelessly impossible and perhaps even naive. And many are suspicious, if not hostile, to the claim to know truth. In his great address at Regensburg in 2006, the Pope really was taking up the whole question of truth and the relationship of truth and reason. He pointed out that for many of our contemporaries, and he's thinking in the world but also in the academy, and I quote, "Only the kind of certainty resulting from the interplay of mathematical and empirical elements can be considered scientific. Anything that would claim to be science must be measured against this criterion." If you know the first article of the Summa, you can certainly see what Pope is getting at. By its very nature, this method excludes the question of God, making it appear as unscientific or as pre-scientific. Therefore, in the university world, skepticism reigns about truth. Nothing is definitive except in the verifiable, the empirically verifiable scientific realm. Therefore, if this university is going to fulfill its mission in the church as a community of teachers and of learners, its curriculum has to face the crisis of truth head on. And it can do this, I think, this university and other Catholic universities. It can do it by arguing convincingly with passion and respect that the truth can indeed be pursued, and it can be attained by the human mind, and it can be communicated and passed on as part of a living tradition to others. That's the service to truth that is the intellectual foundation of a Catholic university. Therefore, it's about reaffirming a passion for truth, which will ensure authentic human flourishing. Catholic universities can imitate today what Aquinas did in the 13th century by imbuing our curriculum with the desire to search freely the whole truth about God, about the human person, and about the world we live in. You know, Thomas was a remarkably serene man who was open to his contemporaries and to their thought. He searched diligently for the truth. He wanted to engage intellectual dialogue with all wise teachers, and he showed an enormous freedom and liberty of spirit and intellectual honesty in dealing with, at that time, were new questions. And he didn't simply reject, sort of the beginnings of answers to the new questions that arose. He was very aware of the need to see truth that was buried in the opinions of others. Saying, for example, these are sort of typical Thomas sayings, there is no false teaching which does not have at least some truth admixed in it. Excuse me. And John Paul observed that for Thomas, this is John Paul saying, this presence of truth, even if it be incomplete and imperfect and at times distorted, even this truth is a bridge uniting every man to other men and makes understanding possible where there is goodwill. Why was Thomas so convinced and in a sense so serene? The answer is straightforward. He recognized the presence of the Holy Spirit, who was already at work opening the human heart and making it ready to welcome the truth. And one of his most famous statements, I think he's citing from Ambrosiaster, but he says, any truth, no matter by whom it is spoken, any truth, no matter by whom it is spoken, is from the Holy Spirit. The action of the Spirit creates an affinity for the truth and draws the human heart towards it. The Spirit helps human knowledge mature into wisdom. He succeeded in establishing a fruitful confrontation as well with Arab and Hebrew thought of his time. He treated them respectfully, but he wasn't overawed by them. So must scholars today in a Catholic university, with a similar grace, one hopes, bequeathed by the Holy Spirit, be free to examine truth wherever it is found. Pope Paul VI sums up this attitude of Thomas to all the great masters of human thought, an attitude, this respect for truth in the masters, that this should undergird the university, which seeks to preserve and to enrich and to hand on that great moral, intellectual, and artistic tradition which is ours as Catholics. He says first, Paul says this, first, looks at Thomas, he said, how did he do it? He said, he began with the admiration for the intellectual patrimony of others, even non-Christian thinkers. Then he recognized the significance but also the limitations of his interlocutors. And thirdly, this is something we often forget, he was compassionate towards those who, like the philosophers of antiquity, that they lacked the gift of faith. They could have the beginnings, they could have inklings, but to expect from them the fullness without the faith is to expect too much. And then Paul VI speculated, and this is interesting, on how Thomas would confront contemporary questions. This is in his 1974 letter. He says we, he means I, we are convinced that were he Thomas among us today, he would be no less eager to investigate the forces that are bringing about changes in man, his conditions, his manner of thinking, and his way of life. Whatever would help him now to speak of God more worthily and persuasively than ever before would be, in his eyes, a cause for rejoicing. Yet in all this, he would never lose that serene, magnanimous sense of security which faith alone can bestow on the human mind. And so the angelic doctor is for us and for a Catholic university a marvelous example to Christian scholars, reminding them to be open to the signs of the times that are shaping our age, yet faithful to the path marked out by faith. And that this discussion was civil, respectful, is also not to be forgotten. Now a word about Thomas as the Doctor Concordiae, this teacher of harmony. And I mean the harmony of faith and reason. He is the preeminent teacher, really, of this relationship between faith and reason, what John Paul, sort of poetically called, the two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of the truth. Indeed, already, John Paul, when he on his trips, he'd always talk to university communities, and when he was at Leuven in Belgium in 1984, he summed up Thomas's thought very well. Here's John Paul. The whole living tradition of the church teaches us this: faith seeks understanding, and understanding seeks faith. Both the need to understand and the need to believe are deeply rooted in man's heart. It is for this reason that the church herself was the point of departure for the creation of universities, because of this. Nonetheless, I think a particular challenge faces us today in that many are detaching or would detach faith from reason and reason from faith. We can meet these challenges if Thomas is our master, Benedict says. With his charism as a philosopher and theologian, Thomas offered an effective model of harmony between reason and faith, dimensions of the human spirit that are completely fulfilled in the encounter and dialogue with one another. Faith and reason, they are not to be separated and placed in competition. They go hand in hand, because the reason is simple. They both come from God. Hence, there can be no contradiction between them. On this relationship, John Paul, citing Thomas, it was an address given to the 8th International Thomistic Congress, he said this: philosophical and theological truth converge in a single truth. The truth of reason ascends from creatures to God, and the truth of faith descends directly from God to man. But this diversity of method and origin does not detract from their fundamental unity, because there is a single identical author of truth manifested through creation, and truth communicated personally to man by means of his Word, the incarnate Son. Philosophical research and theological research, he concluded, are two different directions of the same single truth, destined to meet but not collide on the same road in order to help one another. There is then, and Benedict, using one of the terms that he uses in so many other contexts, he talks so often about friendship, and in his, I think it was a general audience address, he talks about a natural friendship exists between faith and reason, founded in the order of creation itself. The origin of Christian faith, there is, of course, not only the Jerusalem of the theologian, but also the Athens of the philosopher. And Benedict, in his sort of comments that surround Thomas's understanding of harmony, he goes out of his way not just to talk about the harmony between faith and reason, that this harmony has a Christological center. That center is in the Logos, in the incarnate Word. It's in Jesus Christ. And Benedict is convinced of the need for contemporary thinkers, for universities, to rediscover anew what he calls human rationality open to the light of the divine Logos and his perfect revelation, which is in Jesus Christ, Son of God, made man. Again, from his talk at Regensburg. Not a Catholic university, though it has a Catholic faculty. Nor does the Pope only exhort scholars. In countless homilies and discourses, what is emerging as one of his favorite quotations is that of, in the first letter of St. Peter, the injunction to every Christian, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is within you. Know how to explain the hope that you have as a believer. For Benedict, and he's very strong on this, it is the Christian faith that safeguards reason in the modern world. Faith liberates reason from its own limitations. Pure Thomas. God has revealed himself as created reason, the Logos, and he acts as such in our history. In the beginning was the Word, was the Logos, and this Word was made flesh, and we have seen his glory. The glory is of the only Son of the Father. The divine Logos is thus the origin of the universe, and this same one was united, of course, with humanity in the person of Jesus. Therefore, reason, with a capital R, so to speak, is not a mathematics of the universe. It's not just a first cause that then withdrew after producing perhaps an initial spark. As Benedict says, this Logos has a heart such as to be able to renounce its own immensity and take flesh. What's the consequence for higher education? It took the Pope about 7 or 8 months, I remember I was in Rome at the time, to finally talk about universities. Or, you're always waiting, what's he going to say about schools, universities, seminaries. And in his first address, which was actually in the end of November of the first year of his pontificate, he addressed the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, which is the major secular Catholic university in Italy. And he said this: "This, then, is the great challenge to Catholic universities, to impart knowledge in the perspective of true rationality, different from that of today, which largely prevails, in accordance with a reason open to the question of truth and to the great values inscribed in being itself, hence open to the transcendent and to God. Because God himself is Logos, is reason. Our faith has something that it has to do with reason. That's why it can be passed on. And when faith separates itself from a rational foundation, the very meaning of faith is put at risk. And those of you who know the Regensburg Address, the critique of a decadent Christianity and an unrenewed Islam is precisely that. Without the light of faith, however, human reason cannot find sure and fulfilling answers to our problems. Catholic universities, if they are to remain true to the intellectual tradition which has shaped them from their beginning, why does the Church have them, are called to bear witness not only to the dignity of human reason and its capacity for knowing reality, but also to unearth and to mine the precise role played by faith in learning itself. Therefore, Catholic universities are broader, not narrower in their outlook, since they're open to divine revelation, which of course is the great horizon which the human mind and heart is meant to penetrate. As Father Brezek once reminded us, just from an article he published only he was 90 years old, he said, the combination of the world of revealed knowledge with the world of rational knowledge gives the Catholic University a much more challenging horizon of study. For us, here, the mall without the chapel would be incomplete, and the chapel without the mall would be in solitary exile. We are blessed at UST to have an architectural embodiment of a sound Thomism. The Catholic sacramental imagination demanded the completion of the academic mall crowned by the chapel. And thanks be to God that Joe McFadden finally did it. Moreover, that chapel bespeaks a certain preeminence for faith that it is also important to take account of. When the study of the world guided by reason and faith is taken seriously, a certain hierarchy of importance emerges. That's why theology and philosophy have long been accorded a kind of primi inter pares status in the university's curriculum. It's real hard. Furthermore, fidelity to Thomas also demands that a Catholic university teach theology precisely as a divine science and not religious studies, a human one dependent upon rational inquiry alone. Even though the core beliefs of Christianity, Trinity, incarnation, the Church, are revealed and held by faith, students have to be informed of what they are. Aquinas never thought that explaining the content of the articles of faith, that would provoke a response of faith, but he did think, as we think, that the students need to be told about them. Theology courses at a Catholic university propose sacra doctrina. They set out what Christ taught in the Gospels as the first and chief teacher of the faith, and special attention in a Catholic university is always given, must be given, to ensuring that students learn from theologians who propose the teaching of Christ as authoritative. Authentic Christian faith does not fear reason. It trusts it. It even seeks it out. Human reason loses nothing for its part by opening itself, leaving itself open to consider the question of faith and transcendence. Indeed, when reason is illumined, and this is always the language, when it's lightened up by faith, it's set free from its own fragility, its own limitations that we know derive from sin, and finds the strength necessary to rise even to the knowledge of the triune God. What does this mean for us, for Catholic universities today? Again, Pope Benedict answers in this way. He says the Catholic university is a vast laboratory, where in accordance, I think one is Canadian, I think the word, where in accordance with the different disciplines, ever new areas of research are developed, and he says this great phrase, in a stimulating confrontation between faith and reason that aims to recover the harmonious synthesis achieved by St. Thomas Aquinas and other great Christian thinkers. When firmly grounded in St. Thomas's understanding of faith and reason, Catholic institutions of higher learning can confidently face every possible new challenge that comes up on the horizon, since we know that the truths discovered by any authentic science can never contradict the one truth, who is God himself. The future of this university lies in the hands of a merciful and loving providence, and this conviction grounds our hope. Let me close by citing from one of John Paul II's last messages to the university world, in which he called upon Aquinas to be an exemplary guide for the intellectual apostolate, an apostolate which is shaped and finds its home here in this university. John Paul. Although St. Thomas was firmly rooted in his own day and in medieval culture, he developed a teaching that goes beyond the conditioning of the time in which he lived and can still offer today fundamental guidelines for contemporary reflection. His doctrine and example are a provident reminder of those unchanging perennial truths that are indispensable if we are to foster an existence that is truly worthy of man. And so we must continue here to learn from Thomas. He's our master. He's the icon of the Christian mind in the church today. As the teacher of truth and the teacher of the harmony between faith and reason, Aquinas invites the University of St. Thomas to be a faithful yet creative center of Catholic thought in this, the fourth largest city in the United States of America. Here, I pray, the doctrine, the method, and the inspiration of St. Thomas, what Father Jack Gallagher has referred to as Aquinas' intellectual sinew. I pray that this will engage ever more intentionally the fascinating and complex culture and world in which we live. In a word, our patron invites us to be intelligent, creative, humble, and holy scholars, students, and supporters who are dazzled by the wonder and the order of the universe and by the beauty and the love of God. Thank you all very much.
Father, when you were deputy of the in Rome of all the Catholic universities in the world, were the majority of the universities that you visited and were Catholic?
Yes. Yeah, the Holy See's interest in higher education, of course, is specifically for the universities that are Catholic in origin and mostly in certainly by tradition and usually still by specific adherence, of which there are 1,300 in the world and 220 in the United States, only 17 in Canada. Catholic universities are being founded at for example, by the year in places like Mexico, Chile, Brazil. There are universities that are of the south of Brazil that have 45,000 Catholics in a Catholic university. Often institutions that aren't on our sort of on our mindset. There are a lot of new universities being founded as well in Africa, the Philippines. They're still growing. Cardinal DiNardo, you can make an observation on this.
No, I want to thank Archbishop Miller, first of all, for his presentation tonight. Archbishop, you presented us with the formal possibilities of what you call both the truth, the concord, and the methods of Aquinas. I have a question to you about the methods that Aquinas used nowadays. In his own day, can we, faithful to Aquinas, just use some of the methodology of Aquinas? Are there, because of I don't want to get into the problems that have occurred in the last couple of hundred years, do we have to do, in order to be good Thomas, can we just use Thomas's more formal methods? Do we need some other approaches philosophically to get at what he's doing? It's a genuine question. It's not meant to be
Yeah.
trick or anything.
It's not a trick. It's not a trick, Eminence, but it's impossible for me to answer. But particularly, for example, I'll leave aside philosophy because there's the center here. But for example, can we, the extent to which we can, is the content, for example, for doing dogmatic theology, is the only way to approach it and be faithful, is it to follow the specific outline, for example, of the Summa or maybe of the Compendium? Probably not. There are too many other approaches already in the life of the church, and ones that I think, the ressourcement and so on, and biblical scholarship, that they have something to add. What is, I think, very unfortunate is to think that, in fact, there are large numbers of people who study theology, primarily seminarians, who still across the world, perhaps not in our country, but across the world, are, is the great number, seminarians are the great number of those who study, that they never read St. Thomas. Fine if they do it in translation. I think that not to know the method is a great impoverishment of the tradition. I'd hesitate, though, to claim much more than that. The mic is coming to you, right?
I was just wondering, you were talking about, your formation in the seminary, and then you talked about some of the changes after the council in terms of going back to maybe biblical scholarship and sort of more patristics. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how those influences have shaped either priestly formation or like the role of philosophy and education post-council.
You see, I was, in the seminary in theology from 71, my first, for the MDiv, 71 to 74. So we're talking 6 years after the end of the council. Looking back on it, it was a time of enormous insecurity on what should be taught and how it should be taught. The theology I had, which was, I think, probably as good as there was anywhere, was nonetheless quite fragmented. It was dedicated often to reading of articles. The notion that there was a unified or comprehensive or synthetic sort of vision, either of the world or of theology, was probably assumed by the professors because they had been formed in another tradition, but was not passed on formally as such to students. And so the result was a lot of piecemeal and unintegrated sort of information about things that were happening in theology. Fortunately, when I went to Rome, to the Greg, there was still a much stronger sense of theology being a science and a discipline with a coherence and an order. But I must admit that but that's very understandable given the times in which that the church was living in. I mean, I don't resent it. It was as good as it could be, given that this was 6 years after an ecumenical council, but it left, I think, in a certain number of people, it fomented still a certain kind of unrest.
Archbishop Miller, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. Thank you. You're wonderful, Mary.